A crucial week for the litter-strewn streets of France. Today, over 1 million people across the country entered their final day of protests ahead of the final Parliament vote for President Emmanuel Macron's controversial pension reform plan. This will raise the retirement age from 62 to 64 and will also increase the number of years in the workforce needed to claim full pension. France has one of the lowest retirement ages in Europe, much lower than the 67 in Italy or the 68 in the Netherlands, and Macron promised this rise in his election campaign. However, it is drastically unpopular among French citizens, with a disapproval rate of around 70%. And furthermore, Macron may struggle to get it through, as in the recent elections, his centrist government lost its majority, meaning a deal may have to be reached with right-wing delegates or through the controversial Article 49-3, which allows laws to be passed without a vote, which would cause an uproar in France. But with Macron's credibility on the line, could he force this through solely to save face? As the litter piles up in the streets and the strikes continue, did the French government handle this correctly? With people living longer and an eventual ageing population, would it not make more sense to increase the retirement age? What will be the consequences of the French pension reforms?
So let's get to it. What will be the consequences of the French pension reforms? As always, we begin with a quick fire round, 30 seconds each to lay out your initial stance on the matter, and we pick up the conversation from there. So Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, please take the lead. Your 30 seconds around.
At this stage, I think the consequences of the pension reforms are really going to be the consequences of the way the public received the pension reform, that is very badly. It's not such an epoch-changing reform that Emmanuel Macron started a few years back during his first term. This one is just something that sort of moves the problem of funding the pay-as-you-go system less than 10 years ahead.
Yeah.
The real result is going to be the consequences for his presidency.
Yeah, so not so much the reform, but rather the reaction to the reform. Louis, your 30 seconds.
Well, I think Emmanuel Macron is playing with fire, really. As we just heard, the majority of the French are opposed to the reform, and you have seen in other countries, such as Italy, that if you put in place a reform against the will of the people, the risk is that that actually gives rise to the far right. So he's really playing with fire. He's doing that, as we just heard, for his international profile. But is it worth it?
Okay, last but not least, Ross Cullen, your take?
Well, the consequences of the reform depend on Thursday on how the reform is passed, if it is passed, whether it gets through with a simple majority of lawmakers, or if the government has to use 49.3, that special constitutional instrument. That will also play into how the consequences of this reform are perceived, how it managed to get through Parliament.
So perception is everything in this case, and some would suggest in any other case as well. And from this point onwards, let's feel free to interact, dear panelists. So let's begin with again the appearance, the optics of things. Should the French government have handled it differently? Did it underestimate to an extent the scope and scale of the public dismay, Lisa?
Well, I think Emmanuel Macron and his government, they have been very clumsy in how to go about this. If you look back, there is this report by the so-called COR, that is a government-mandated committee that had to analyze the pension system and say, is a reform needed or not? And when you read these pages, they are actually writing, there will be a slight deficit. At the moment, we're not having a deficit. In the future, there might be one, and yet it's not going to be dramatic. So if you want to put in place a reform or not, that really depends on your political preferences. And then after that, the government has been, announcing things like, yeah, we're going to help, women. Women will have have a better situation than men, than people who have started early. They will not suffer that much from started work early. They will not suffer that much from that reform. Turns out they got lots of crossed wires. They got things wrong, and many people just don't trust the government anymore. They feel that this reform is maybe not needed. Even economists who talk about the reform, some of these economists I've been talking to have been telling me, we have carried out several reforms in the past of the pension system here in France, and we don't feel this one is necessary, at least one part of the economists I've been talking to.
But Anne-Elisabeth, the mathematics here are quite simple. Not enough working people to cover for non-working people. So what is the best way to really pay for those pensions? What's the alternative? Is there an alternative?
I'm amazed that the government was unable to give a few simple figures. In 1945, when France created its social welfare system, there were 8 people working to pay for 1 pensioner. Today, you've got fewer than 2, slightly under 2 people working to pay for 1 pensioner. It is very obvious that the system is not sustainable, considering that the French system is a pay-as-you-go system in which what you yourself pays for the pensioners who are around. So more pensioners, fewer people paying. And another problem, which has been a little mentioned during this attempt to sell the reform, it's that most pensioners themselves they look at the time when they're going to retire, but they know that after the age of 50 they will not find a job because bosses don't like hiring people above 50. Which is also a problem, even though the workforce needs more workers. So all of this is really a mess.
So speaking to that point exactly, this mess that you're illustrating, Ross, will raising retirement age solve France's employment problem?
Yeah, Emmanuel Macron is dealing with a problem when it comes to the unemployment figures as well. He wants to try to show that there is a path for people who want to get back into work, who want to work longer, who want to stay working longer, and also they want to be older as well. I guess part of the reform that is also in that package of proposed legislation is the seniors index, to try to show that companies with 300 or more employees have to release data on how many older employees they have, to try to encourage people to hold on to some of those older employees. Throughout this whole process, some of the voices that we've been speaking to, we've heard that there is a problem if you are having your contract renewed, if you're in your 50s, either wanting to get a new contract at your current place of employment, or you've left and you want to find a new job and you're in your late 50s and your early 60s. That can really be a problem. So there is an issue at both ends of the system when it comes to working people, fewer working people further back down the line, and also an increase in the growing aging population.
So speaking on the different ends of the problem, on the flip side of the more mature population, Lisa, we are seeing many youngsters, including some who haven't even entered the job force yet, joining the protests in full steam. So it brings me to ask you whether the protest is about pensions, or is it about the changing value, if you will, of work in modern society per se, and in French society in particular?
I think that's a very good point. I mean, people here feel this is not just about the pension reform, also because, as I said, the government has not been very good at bringing across that message that this reform was really needed. So many people here have been telling me, we feel like the government is putting a question mark over the very heart of the social security system. Lots of people are not denying that the pension reform, the pension system needs to be reformed in one way or another, but they just don't feel this exact reform is needed. And also they think that it's a bigger question, really, that it's about, what kind of society do we want to live in? We heard before that France has a pay-as-you-go system. France is actually one of the very few countries in the world that has a pure pay-as-you-go system. So people here don't tend to not have a private pension fund. And that's why this pension system is really important for them. And they feel that even if it's more difficult to finance, that the government should make that extra effort, or that another way should be found, so that people who, especially those, who've had a very difficult job, who've started working really at an early age, that these people should be allowed to retire quite early, not that late, really.
Anne-Elisabeth, are we to see this this deja vu from May 68? Is this the demonstration not of the present, but rather of the future?
This is not really a demonstration about like May 68, because May 68 was actually a very optimistic time. And the revolutionaries thought that the future was a revolution and the others didn't. But France was extremely prosperous. There was practically full employment. We're talking about entirely different times. But what this is really is a motion of defiance against a government that is seen as remote, as not understanding the people and not bothering to understanding the people. And it's got to do with a special style of Emmanuel Macron to some extent, but also with the perception that French society is fractured and polarized in a way that most Western societies are nowadays. And it's very interesting that the people who protest most against this reform come from both ends of the horseshoe. You've got the hard right and the hard left, and you've got enough people who are uneasy in the middle that they also sort of tend to join the protesters. The other thing is that like many movements in France that catch fire, this is more than just about the pensions. It's a mistrust of the government. And it's a mistrust of a series of people in the government, several presidents who are all technocrats, and all seem to be telling the people, we know better, now shut up.
Well put. Before we will dive in further into the politics ripple effect, if you will, right after the break. But as we're nearing the end of the first part of our discussion, Ross, I will allow myself to be quite blunt with the following question: are the French being a bit too greedy, perhaps this time around?
I believe that there's a special understanding in France for the position of working people. In fact, some of those protesters we were speaking to at the most recent mobilizations have been saying, why are the people in the Netherlands or Germany or the UK not demonstrating to try to get their governments to fall back and have a lower pension age so you can retire earlier? Why would they accept to have retirement age at 65, 66, 67? The French calling for other nations to come out on the streets to demand that their governments bring the retirement age back down to the early 60s. Where it is.
Interesting. It's not us demanding too much. It's you demanding too little. Okay, we're putting a stop right here because we do need to take a very short break. But when we get back, we unpack the political winners and losers in the before, during, and after the pension reform saga. So a few minutes, and we are back with the summit. So do not go anywhere. We're back in a bit. Welcome back to the summit. Still with us, Lisa Louis, Ross Cullen, and Anne-Elisabeth Moutet. Thank you all so very much for staying with us. We're also staying on topic, of course, but before we get back to our conversation, the government not backing down, as we've been discussing, implying that they would really love to, if the popular support will be garnered on that, but they would still go ahead with it even if there is none. Let's take a listen to the government's spokesperson and pick it up from there.
We do not want to use the 49-3 procedure avoiding the parliamentary vote. We want to transform our relative majority into an absolute majority on the pension bill, and we have given ourselves the means to do so by gradually developing our project. I remind you that initially we were talking about a retirement age of 65 years old, and today it's 64 years old. And then we introduced strong measures, important measures by way of amendments, listening to the unions, to the political parties, notably the majority, but also the opposition.
So let's get to it, to the democratic problem. If they do the 49-3, if 70% of the public against it, is the bill undemocratic. Lisa Louis, your 30 seconds are on.
Well, I think it would send, obviously, a very bad signal. Emmanuel Macron was trying to convince the French population that this reform is necessary. When you look at the ongoing protests and at the different opinion polls, it's quite clear that he has not succeeded in convincing people in the streets. And if he has to use that special procedure, he has also failed to convince other parliamentarians, obviously.
Ross Cullen, your thoughts?
Yeah, 49.3 is a controversial measure. That special parliamentary instrument has been used numerous times by the Prime Minister, Elizabeth Borne, when it comes to budgetary measures. There is one other policy that can be applied to, and it seems that the government is holding it in reserve in case it needs to apply it to the pensions legislation tomorrow.
Last but definitely not least, Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, your thoughts?
It would be completely constitutional. This is part of the French constitution written at the time of General de Gaulle. Article 49.3 has been used by various governments and presidents over the years, and it will create resentment. But the resentment exists already, and many bills that passed in France actually and which changed the nation have been passed that way. It's not a problem.
Okay, and let's feel free to engage in a conversation from this point onward. So again, feel free to interact. Maybe we need to frame the debate differently. Macron, at the end of the day, is going against all odds, if you will, willing to bear the costs for what he believes is best for the country. Maybe he's being somewhat heroic, Ross.
Well, Emmanuel Macron won't be facing any costs when it comes to running a re-election campaign. He won't be standing in 2027, and so to some extent he can bring in unpopular policies or push unpopular policies. We have to remember as well that Emmanuel Macron did win the election in 2022 on this promise that he said he wanted to continue what he started and didn't manage to do in his first term, which is raise the retirement age and carry out pensions reform. He was voted in, he won the election. That was a clear manifesto promise that he had as part of his campaign that was known, that was publicised. What needs to happen, I believe, though, is if you win an election like that, though, where a lot of your support is an anti-opposition vote, a lot of people were voting against Marine Le Pen. They weren't voting specifically for Emmanuel Macron. And so you could argue that the president has to perhaps interpret that result differently, that yes, there was a vote for him to win, and he did have pensions reform as part of his campaign package, but also in the interim period afterwards, you need to be able to interpret and understand that there is a lot of anger on the streets and there is a lot of pushback against these reforms.
And Anne-Elisabeth, well, there is a lot of pushback and obviously a lot of pressure. There are those just sitting there on some parts of the political landscape, smiling, gaining momentum. Who are the winners? Who are the losers?
I'm not sure there are many winners on this one, except the opposition, the hardline opposition. We've seen some pretty disgraceful scenes in the National Assembly during the first round of a discussion of the bill, with several tens of thousands of amendments being fielded by the new left-wing alliance, which skews very, very hard left. With people shouting, with people almost getting to blows in the House. The Senate was much calmer for many reasons, including that it's the upper house and they don't do that. But in general, the portrait of the parliamentary democracy has not been helped so much by the fact that you've got probably 1/4 of the MPs now who say power is not in the National Assembly, power is in the street. That has consequences, and they're not very, very good. The other thing is that there are parties that will support this bill because they say we would do it if it were our candidate fielding it. It's the Républicains, the Rump party of what used to be the great French Gaullist party, the party of Chirac and Sarkozy. But it's not helping them because the bill itself is actually a bad bill when it's been sort of rehashed the way it has been and with the concessions that have been made. It's not worth the massive trouble for the government government and the loss of image. And those who vote for it within those parties, and it won't be all of them, will find themselves lumped with the Macroniste. And what remains, of course, you have people who like the hard left, and then you have Marine Le Pen, who's been very quiet, very calm, very respectable, and who's basically waiting for this to show that she is the one who's a serious politician and not the others.
Yeah, and on that note, Lisa Louis, back to Macron to an extent. Can you govern with a country against you?
Well, that's what he has been doing to a certain extent. I think he's used to that. What he's now doing is he's working on his legacy. As Ross said, he knows that he won't be re-elected in 4 years' time. So he wants to leave a trace. He's always been depicting himself as a strong European, as an international statesman. And that's what he's working on now. He wants to show the world that he is capable to reform this country that can't be reformed. But obviously, he's running a certain risk. As I said in the beginning, he's playing with fire because that might really give more strength to the far right. But Macron is really focused on the fact that he wants to be seen as a very strong statesman, so he can play an important role on an international level, especially when it comes to the Russian invasion in Ukraine, for example.
Yeah, Anne-Elisabeth, you seemed quite amused by the question.
I think the one great disaster which is less sort of present in the minds of the citizens is the disaster of French political international standing and foreign policy. We no longer have a diplomatic corps because Macron suppressed it. And we have a seesawing foreign policy. Sometimes we say Russia must not be humiliated. Sometimes Macron says Ukraine must be supported. It's been the same thing in Africa, in which he went on a tour of 4 African countries 2 weeks ago, in which he managed to offend most of the people he visited. I'm not sure his legacy in foreign policy is going to be that good.
So, Ross, before we wrap it up, briefly, if you can, now there's the legitimacy boost dilemma, whether the government should risk the bill being rejected, right?
Yeah, I mean, that is a possibility. It's seen as the least likely of the 3 options that the bill is rejected. Most likely is the bill is passed with the government getting support of the opposition, the centre-right party, as Anne-Elisabeth was saying, the Republicans of Chirac and Sarkozy. The use of 49.3 is also a possibility, but I think it's worth mentioning as well that although he won't be facing re-election, his MPs could well be standing again. Yeah. For re-election, and so they may well have this as a millstone around their neck. But there are other policies. Macron is clearly, as Lisa says, trying to build a social policy legacy. He has already moved on other social policies, and we know that there is a call at the moment to enshrine, for example, abortion rights into the constitution, or perhaps a discussion, debate about legalising assisted suicide. So when it comes to pensions as well, Macron is clearly trying to build a specific social policy legacy.
Yeah, legacy. Force that is driving leaders all over the world. Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, Lisa Louis, and Ross Cullen, thank you so very much for this.